So if you can hear me clearly, today I'm really excited to be here virtually. I'm really sorry I can start my video. Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you for the reminder. Yes, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I hope everyone is enjoying the symposium. I'm really excited to be here to share some findings from my lab on music and language processing in Mandarin-speaking autistic children. And then we're going to briefly discuss the implications for language development, which is the topic of the symposium. Yeah, so let's get started. Okay, let's see. All right, so a brief introduction on language and music processing in autism. As a lot of you know, maybe around 30% of autistic children have no or few words despite many years of interventions. In contrast, a lot of autistic individuals have been shown to have enhanced or at least intact music processing, with many really talented musicians having perfect pitch, which is the absolute pitch where one can identify the note without any reference note. So the major question for me about 10 years ago is that what's the relationship between music and language processing given the discrepancy we see with relatively impaired language processing but enhanced music processing, especially in terms of pitch. A lot of autistic children have perfect pitch, as I mentioned. So with this major question in mind, I applied and received a starting grant from the European Research Council, which is entitled Cracking the Pitch Code in Music and Language, Insights from Congenital Amusia and Autism Spectral Disorder, which lasted 6.5 years. We ran it between 2016 and 2023. And I had a project partner, Professor Cunmei Jiang from Shanghai Normal University, and 4 collaborators, Patrick Wang, Annie Patel, Peter Fordresher, and Bill Thompson. So with a lot of my team members together, we conducted a series of behavioral and EEG experiments to address 3 different aims. The first is that we want to look into how pitch processing capacity, memory ability, and also cognitive processing styles impact music, language, and emotion processing in autism and amusia. And then that's behavioral studies. And then we'll also run a series of EEG studies to look into from which processing stages the 2 conditions start to diverge. Is it at early pre-processing, pre-attentive processing, or later semantic or synthetic processing? And the final aim is that we want to compare English versus Mandarin speakers. We want to see whether tone language background would impact any of the characteristics we observe. So today's talk, I'm going to focus on our findings on Mandarin speaking children. 4 studies, mainly done by Alice Wang, currently based in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Chen Zhao and Jia Hongong, who were my postdocs in the lab. So I'm going to talk about 4 topics, and then the goal is to see whether from the findings we can think about the implications for language development, because in the literature it has been proposed that there may be a causal relationship between language impairment and superior pitch perception in autism. So based on the findings, we're going to discuss this briefly at the end of the talk. So an overview of a participant. So we published 4 papers from these participants, and this characteristics were taken from the Wang et al. 2025 in autism. So as you can see, we have around 33 children with autism and matched with 30 non-autistic children, and their age range is between 7 to 15. So we'll have young, early children between 7 to 12, and then 12 to 15, they're adolescents. So the mean age for the groups around 11. As you can see, the non-autistic children are slightly older than the autistic children, 1 year older on average. And then when you look at the musical training background, we calculate the years of formal music training of the participants. You can see that the autistic participant seems to have a slightly longer musical training compared to the non-autistic participants. And then we also measured their receptive vocabulary using the picture test, vocabulary test. As you can see, non-autistic children seems to have a higher vocabulary level than the autistic children. And this difference is actually significant. We try really hard to match the two groups, but it turns out that if you want to match the groups in age, it's likely that the vocabulary knowledge cannot be matched with the autistic individuals turn out to be lower in terms of vocabulary. And then we also asked whether the participant had perfect pitch, which is the absolute pitch, and 2 of the autistic children and 3 of the non-autistic children self-reported having absolute pitch. So that's, you can see there's a slight mismatch between the groups, despite the fact that we try really hard to match them. Autistic group seems to have longer musical training, and non-autistic children seems to have better vocabulary knowledge and also older in terms of age, slightly older. So that's the misbalance or imbalance across the two groups that we need to take into account when interpreting the results I share here today. So let me move on to the first study on mental representation of pitch done by my former PhD student, Alice Wong. So what are the mental representations of pitch? This concept was actually developed by our colleague in one of the papers they published in 2018, where they showed this paradigm. So using this paradigm, on each trial, you would present the participant with 2 stimuli. So in our case, we want to see the mental representation of the rising pitch in our participants. In their paper, they want to see what's the mental representation of a statement versus a question. So their question is, okay, I present you 2 stimuli. It's presented in French, but in English, it's really, really. So they ask the participant to choose which token sounds more like question. So after the participant chose the responses, there are around 400 or 600 trials, and they averaged across the pitch contour of the token that was chosen as a question, then average across the pitch contour of that not chosen, then the difference between the average contours will give you the mental representation of the rising intonation in French here. As you can see, the rising intonation in French seems to be rising overall, have the rising contour. So this is how we derive mental representation based on this paradigm. So when Alice was doing her PhD, we got in touch with the authors in that paper, and we adopted their Python scripts, and we designed our own experiment to study mental representation of pitch in autism. Alice designed the 3 conditions. One is speech, non-speech, and the music. So I'm going to show you. Hopefully you can hear the sound, what they sound like. So this is the speech condition. You're going to hear 2 sounds, and you're going to be asked which sound sounds more like a rising pitch. Okay. So the participants was asked, oh, which sound sounds like me, confused, 迷路的意思 in Mandarin. And then in the complex tone condition, we have this complex tone. Participants were asked which one sound more like a rising pitch. And this is the music condition. We use this nursery rhyme. You can hear here.
真奇怪，真奇怪。
participant will ask which version sounds more like the real musical notation of the real melody here.
真奇怪.
So this is original correct melody. Yeah, this is a task. And then participants were presented 400 trials for the speech and non-speech, and for the music, they were presented 300 trials. And here's the results. So we plotted the mental representation of the rising curve across the different conditions. As you can see, the orange color represents the autistic group, and non-autistic group was represented by the slightly turquoise color, blue color. And this is the speech condition. And then we run this multinomial regression and want to see at the degree of the pitch curve, at what degree can the curve to be represented. So across both groups, the cubic fit seems to be the best. So as you can see, we do not observe any group differences in terms of mental representation or pitch in speech here. Similarly, we did not observe any significant difference in terms of the complex tone pitch representation, although the shape was slightly different, with autistic group has a quartic pitch contour and the non-autistic group has a cubic pitch contour, but you can see that the two groups pitch representation actually overlap significantly. And you can also observe that the individual differences among the autistic group seems to be larger. As you can see, this standard error that surrounding this mean curve seems to be larger for the autistic group compared to the non-autistic group. So the overall picture is that we did not observe any group difference in terms of mental representation of pitch across speech and complex tone. So now it's the mental representation of melody. Remember, the melody is 真奇怪. And as you can see, the first note and the last note has the same pitch distance with the second note, which is 5 semitones. When you look at the pitch representation of the autistic group, their representation seems to follow the musical notation better than the non-autistic group, because the non-autistic group, for some reason, think the final note is higher compared to the other two notes.
真奇怪.
So the overall finding on the melody is that both groups showed a mean pitch kernel consistent with the prototypical melodic contour. However, the autistic group seems to have a higher correlation with their mental representation, correlates better with musical notation. So their musical mental representation seem to be better, although it's not significantly different from the non-autistic group. So yeah, so to summarize the findings, in terms of mental representation of pitch in autism, the two groups are similar across all domains. However, the autistic participant did exhibit diverse profiles. When we correlate the individual participant within group, the correlations within the autistic group is lower than the non-autistic group, indicating a much more diverse profile across the autistic group. Yeah, so this is the overall finding of this study. We're also looking to whether age, gender, and receptive vocabulary would show impact on the results. We didn't observe any. So it looks like the mental representation of pitch across domains are not impacted by age, gender, or vocabulary, verbal ability. All right. So the second finding is related to tone and intonation processing, where we did a tone and intonation discrimination tasks for autistic and non-autistic children. And this is in collaboration with Alice Chen and Patrick Wong. So in the tone discrimination task, we have two conditions. One is word pair. So those are words. For example,
千元,千元.
And then the other condition is non-word pairs. So those words, those words do not exist in Mandarin.
相态
And we want to see whether there's a difference in processing the tonal contrast between words versus non-words in autistic and non-autistic children. What we observed is that actually there's no significant condition effect for either group, and also there's no group difference or group condition interaction. Again, we observed very similar performance on tone discrimination across conditions in autism here. However, we did include this receptive verbal ability in the model, and it significantly impacts the results across all individuals, with those with higher verbal ability showing better performance on tone discrimination across both groups. And then for the intonation discrimination task, we have 20 statement question pairs and 20 gliding tone pairs. And just want to see whether when the pitch were stripped off the meaning, whether participant can do differently in terms of discriminating the pitch patterns. So I'm going to play the sounds to you.
物菌做饭，物菌做饭，
As you can see, the pitch contours across the two conditions are exactly the same, but one has meaning, another doesn't. So the results again resembles the one we got for tone discrimination. Here again, we didn't observe any group effect or group condition interaction. And also the receptive verbal ability seems to have a huge impact on performance across all participants. So the overall finding on tone and intonation discrimination in autism is that the two groups did not differ, showing similar performance. However, we also found some really interesting patterns in terms of how individual differences in musical training, nonverbal IQ, receptive verbal ability, and short-term memory can impact performance on tone and intonation discrimination here, especially for the autistic group. We observed significant correlations between the background measures and performance on the tone and intonation task across the conditions in the autistic group, in the autistic group, but not so much for the non-autistic group. Okay, now moving on to speech and song imitation. So this is a study conducted in collaboration with Peter Fordrash and Cun Meijiang, where we asked the participant to imitate the pitch and duration patterns of speech and song. So we will play a model sound, and the participants will listen to it and then reproduce it to try to imitate as accurately as possible both the pitch and duration pattern of the model sound. Then we compared the pitch and duration characteristics of the imitated sounds with the model sound and tried to see whether they match or not. So I'm going to play you some examples. As you can see, these are the pitch contours of 3 examples. The target, which is a model sound, was having the black circle indicating the pitch here. And the imitation by the autistic children was represented by the red squares here. And that by the control child was represented by the green diamond here. So I'm going to play the target sound for you first.
冬天的风，
As you can hear, it's a question with a focus on 风. So this person is asked, are you talking about 冬天的风 rather than 冬天的 other things? And then this is the imitation. Yeah, what's the chat? I'm not sure.
冬天的风，
So this is a imitation by the autistic child.
冬天的风，
This is imitation by a control child. As you can hear and also see from the patterns, the control child seems to mirror the speech token really well, asking a question about 冬天的风, whereas the autistic children, the child didn't really imitate that the subtlety of the speech utterance here that well. So when we compare the group performance on matching the pitch in absolute value, so we measure the absolute pitch deviation between the model and the imitation, we didn't see any group difference here. So autistic children and non-autistic children imitate the absolute pitch to a similar level. However, when you look at the relative pitch deviation, the autistic children seem to show higher deviation, worse performance in terms of matching the relative pitch compared to the non-autistic children. So that's speech imitation. For song imitation,
冬天的风，
that's the model.
冬天的风，冬天的风。
Yeah, so similarly, we observe the results indicating that absolute pitch deviation did not differ across groups. And the relative pitch deviation also did not differ across groups. So both groups imitated song similarly, whereas for speech imitation, the relative pitch seems to be less accurate for the autistic children. Yeah, so that's the main finding on pitch matching in speech versus song during imitation in autism. And we did not observe any significant effects of either age or receptive verbal ability on the imitation performance. So finally, I want to briefly talk about how music language prediction is done across the both domains. This is a really huge project with 14 co-authors on the paper. These are the co-authors. And so the main goal of this paper is to study prediction because our brains are essentially prediction machines. We're constantly try to predict what's going to happen in our environment, what we're going to see, we're going to hear, what we're going to experience based on our past knowledge and expectations. So in the literature, autistic children or individuals have been shown to have atypical linguistic prediction. For example, in this famous example, in the sea, there are fish. And so this is a really popular meal actually in England, fish and chips. So when you ask the children to complete the sentence, some autistic children actually complete it with in the sea there are fish and chips, although it's a meal rather than any sea creatures. So the non-autistic individual usually complete the sentence in the sea there are fish and water or sharks. And then, yeah, as you can see, there seems to be impaired prediction in autism in language. However, when we look at the musical prediction, the finding seems to indicate that they have intact music prediction because they can judge the pitch and tempo manipulations of the continuations of familiar song excerpts really well. So there seems to be a dissociation between linguistic versus musical prediction in autism. So that's where we want to study when we match the two domains, whether we would observe a dissociation in terms of prediction in music and language. For that, we used a closed task. There's a melodic closed task and a sentence closed task. So in the melodic closed task, we play this unfinished melody and ask the participant to sing the last note that comes to their mind. I'm going to play this sound to you later. So this melody is not it's not finished, and the participant usually would produce a note after hearing the melody. this melody matched the other melody, but the final note would come in different shapes and forms because there is no constraint. The constraint is not high enough. So the two melodies differ in the how high constraint it is for the last note. So for the authentic cadence condition, there's a high constraint for the tonic to appear at the final part of the melody. In the non-cadence condition, there's the low constraint. There are many notes that participant can sing because there's no really high constraint on which note that would occur. As you can see, 96% of the time the tonic would appear for the authentic cadence condition. In the non-cadence condition, only 44% of the chance that this note A4 will be produced by participants. So we match the probability of the last note in the music condition to the last word in the sentence condition here. For example here.
他寄了信却没有贴。
So the participant needs to say the last word to complete the sentence.
上课时，他跟同学借。
Yeah, so 邮票 would appear 96% of time, 橡皮 would appear around 44% time. As you can see, we match the probability across the two conditions really well here. So the goal is to compare the performance on how well the participants would complete the final note of the final words based on the probabilities. And then we also did a perception task. We completed the melodies with the most with the expected notes and the most with the high probability for them to occur. We complete them, and then we ask the participant to rate the expectedness rating of the most frequent response, either note or word in the norms. Yeah, so that's the task: production and perception ratings. Before doing that, we want to make sure the participant actually can sing in tune. So we compare the pitch matching ability, and the two groups actually did not differ. So they show similar pitch matching ability for the notes we ask them to imitate. And then this result shows you across the two conditions, remember that authentic cadence have high constraints and the non-cadence have low constraints. And we plotted the results in across the language and the music. As you can see, the autistic group was demonstrated using the red square box, and the non-autistic children were represented by the blue box. When you look at the results, you can see that for the language task, the non-autistic group seems to produce the most frequent notes or words better than the autistic group. When you look at the music task for the stems with high constraints, the autistic group produced more the frequent notes compared to the non-autistic groups. So there seems to be a dissociation between the performance on the language task, in which the non-autistic children perform better, but for the music tasks, the autistic children perform better. Yeah, so that's the main finding here. We also observed significant effects of age, receptive vocabulary ability, and pitch matching deviation on the performance here. When you look at the perceptual ratings, we didn't observe any group effect or group task interaction. Yeah, but the overall finding is that music stimuli receive lower ratings than language stimuli, and stimuli with high constraint receive higher ratings than those with low constraint. This indicates that our design is valid with the different conditions. So what we found is that the predictive processing of music language in autism is likely influenced by individual differences in music, linguistic, and cognitive abilities, because the dissociation we found is driven by the fact that autistic children had more musical training compared to non-autistic children. That's why they did better in the music task. and they had a low vocabulary compared to the non-autistic children. That's why they did worse in the language task. So the dissociation we observed is likely driven by the individual differences rather than by anything else. This was confirmed when we examined the English sample, where we matched the group to a really meticulous level, and then we didn't see any group or group task effects on the task. So we conclude that it's really important to account for confounding factors in studies of music language processing in autism. So that's it. So the main finding we observed intact mental representation of pitch in autism. We also observed intact tone and intonation processing in autism, and while the mental representation was not impacted by age, gender, or verbal ability, tone, intonation, processing are heavily influenced by those abilities. And we also observe atypical imitation of relative pitch in speech, although neither age or receptive ability had a significant impact. And we observed the intact predictive process in music, but atypical prediction of language. However, this pattern seems to be influenced by age, receptive verbal ability, and pitch matching abilities. So that's the overall summary of what we have found across the 4 studies. So what can these findings tell us about the implications for language development? Is there a causal relationship between language impairment and the superior pitch perception at all? Although we did not directly address this question, what we found is that from autistic children aged 7 to 15 who have verbal language, what we found that is that autistic individuals with verbal language show intact, not superior pitch perception. And their age, their musical training background, and the linguistic cognitive abilities positively influence how they perform on higher level music language tasks, for example, tone intonation and predictive processing. And then, yeah, so this question whether there's a causal relationship between language impairment and superior pitch processing remains to be answered. Actually, I'm currently working on a grant application to address this question. I would welcome any collaborations if anyone is interested in collaborating. So I will be working on English speakers, and anyone who wants to work on Mandarin or Cantonese speakers, feel free to talk to me after the symposium. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really grateful for all the support from my mentors and collaborators and the members of my team, and the funding.